The small village of Bury lies off the beaten track, located about halfway between Pulborough to the north and Arundel to the south. Bury most likely developed as the centre of a prosperous Norman manorial estate and was still a thriving agricultural community right up until the early 1900s. Up until 1999, the locals would probably have enjoyed a pint of ale or cider in the building behind me, which was then the Black Dog and Duck. However, now it's a private house. It started out in the mid-1800s, serving labourers on the navigation and then the railway, and by 1870 was a beer house run by George Henley, a coal and lime merchant, who had previously run the local shop. By 1911, the landlord was his son Henry. There were once two other pubs in the village, the Bluebell, which has long since disappeared, and the White Horse, now known as the Squire and Horse. Perhaps it was the farming community that kept these pubs alive 100 years ago. We know from the 1911 census that more than 2/3 of the local community were farmers or farm workers, and that's thirsty work. As well as its pubs, Bury also had a shop, located near the centre of the village on what is imaginatively called the street. The shop no longer exists and is now a private house, made distinctive by the many gargoyles set in the wall. Just up the street is Bury House, purchased in 1926 for £9,000 by the author John Galsworthy, where he remained until his death in 1933. This house dates from 1910 and was built on the site of Martin's Farm, which burned down the year before. Much of the information about the village comes from this book, All About Bury by Lillian E. Brown, published in 1948. One of the characters she mentions is George Dearling. George was a local carrier, despite having cataracts in both eyes from birth. Known locally as the blind carrier, he did manage to teach himself to find his way over miles of field and road. He had an exceptional memory, although he was unable to read or write, and he was often consulted when matters of events or dates were being discussed. George would have operated a horse-drawn van similar to this, and it's very likely he would have been a regular at the Black Dog and Duck. He may even have been in this photograph, taken around 1900. We know he came to this pub because in 1890 a part of his load was stolen while he was drinking there. William Lidbetter, alias Andrews, aged 14, stole cocoa, notepaper and envelopes, value 8 3/4. He ate some of the cocoa and dumped the rest of the haul. His punishment was 6 strokes of the birch. George's partial blindness may well have isolated him from postcards, but the Dearling family was well represented, and there are several cards sent to George's brother Edward by his daughter Flo. They chart his progress in rank from corporal to sergeant in the Royal Field Artillery at Bulford Camp. Before enlisting, he was a chauffeur, a rare occupation at the time. Already an army pensioner from 12 years previous service, including the Boer War, Edward served this time in home postings on medical grounds. He finished in 1919 as Battery Sergeant Major at Larkhill Training School. This is the old vicarage, which plays an important part in the story of Bury through its postcards. In the early 1900s, the vicarage was occupied by the Reverend John Edward Sale, seen here with his wife and daughter. Their servant was Bertha Lee, who also collected postcards. This one was sent to Bertha at the vicarage in 1908. Bertha Lee has been a great source of Bury's postcards, many of which still exist and are featured in this film. She was born to George and Olive in 1889 and lived with them in Hillside Cottage until sometime after 1901, when she received cards addressed to the vicarage. By 1911, Bertha had moved with the Erskine family to Scotland and continued to receive postcards of Bury from family and friends. In those days, stamps were sometimes attached at an angle, signalling a hidden message from the sender. A stamp angled left represented a kiss, angled right meant, "Please accept my love." It's very likely that Bury was once a significant inland port on the River Arun, the large manor house and barn providing evidence of former prosperity. This is the end of the road for MG and me, in the sense that the church lane comes to a dead end right here. And this is the reason the lane ends where it does. We're on the site of George Henley's barge operation, some 100 years ago. His barges transported goods up and down the Arun, delivering here to the wharf. On occasions, the deliveries were announced from the church pulpit, just over there behind the trees. The flood bank, built in the 1960s, covers the original flat area where George Henley could have floated his barges ashore on a spring tide. This card, from around 1900, shows a barge resting in its natural dry dock. In the early 20th century, pleasure boats were often seen on the Arun. This photo was taken around 1920. Here's the unusual sight of a traction engine, in steam, close to the wharf. The operator, William Francis, who doesn't seem to be present, is listed in the 1911 census. Also mentioned is the ferry woman, most likely in this photo Mrs. Jane Shepherd, mother of 13 children. She was said to do the job as well as any man. Her daughter, Mrs. Ada Marshall, followed her in the role. The ferry was first recorded in 1292, and it operated right up until 1955, the last to function on the Upper Arun. Bob Dudden, shown here in about 1930, was the final ferryman at Bury. As there's no longer a ferry, I thought I'd bring my own. I'll head over to the other bank, see if I can land, and go and have a look at Amberley and its historic castle.